She entered the wrong car on New Year's Eve. The Mafia boss pinned the doors and said, "You're not leaving, little bird." She couldn't speak. He didn't listen. She never knew that by the time the clock struck midnight, she would be the town's newest unsolved mystery. Lainey Prescott got into the wrong car at 11:50 p.m. on New Year's Eve, wearing a wool coat she'd inherited from her grandmother, and boots caked with slush from trudging through the mounting blizzard. In exactly 4 minutes, semi-automatic fire would tear through the silence of the snow. In exactly 10 minutes, she would be racing into the frozen wilderness, her name already whispered as the latest entry in the town's unsolved disappearances, the very archives she dedicated her life to unraveling. But she didn't know any of that yet. Right now, she was standing outside the shuttered diner on the edge of the rural Pacific Northwest, watching her phone flicker with the last bars of signal before the storm claimed it. "Damn this weather," she muttered, stamping her feet against the cold. "Nothing like the holidays to bury you alive. If you are listening right now, help me prove them wrong. They said this channel would never grow. But every empire starts in silence. Subscribe to the Syndicate Stories and help build this one. Now, let's continue." It wasn't the howling wind, or the relentless flakes, or even the isolation of the empty lot. It was the way New Year's Eve amplified the quiet voids in her life, leaving her stranded in places like this, reminded of how the world moved on without noticing her. Just another midnight proving what she already knew. Some stories got told, and some vanished into the cold, forgotten, like the cases she pored over in the dim library stacks. The diner's annual staff party had been exactly what she'd braced for: forced small talk, watery punch, and that peculiar ache of being amid locals who nodded politely without really seeing her. She'd excused herself early, slipping into the night. The blizzard hit her like a wall. December in these mountains, unforgiving if you faced it alone, and Lainey had no one waiting. She watched her phone drain from 5% to dead. The screen went black. A rugged black SUV rolled up, headlights cutting through the whiteout, and a wave of relief washed over her. She didn't double-check the make or plates, her hands were numb, and she just wanted to get home to her quiet apartment and her files. She pulled open the back door and slid inside. "Thank goodness," she sighed, settling into the worn leather. "To the old mill road, please. I'm the one who requested the ride. My phone just died, but it should be in your app. Could you crank the heat? I think my toes are frostbitten." A voice sliced through her words like a gust of Arctic wind. "Who the hell are you?" Lainey's eyes flew open. The man in the driver's seat had twisted around, and everything in her froze. Steel gray eyes locked onto hers, set in a face rugged as the timber he milled, strong jaw, dark stubble, an intensity that weighed her presence like a threat he was deciding how to neutralize. She fumbled for words, stuttering under that piercing gaze. I'm the fare you picked up. The ride to the edge of town. You're the driver, right?" He held her stare. Then his gaze darted to the side mirror, and his features sharpened to stone. The SUV surged forward with a roar, slamming her back into the seat. "Hey!" She clutched the armrest, outrage surging. "What are you doing? Stop, I'll report this." Another vehicle emerged from the storm, dark and aggressive, pulling up beside them. A window lowered. Muzzles flashed. The sound that tore from her was primal. "Is that, oh God?" A hand reached back, fisted her coat, and yanked her down toward the floorboards. "Stay down. One command. Not negotiable." The first burst of gunfire shredded the rear window. Lainey cried out, shards of glass cascading as she buried her face in the mat. More rounds rat-tat-tat, and she heard him barking orders into a radio. Voice steady, as if ambushes were just another shift at the mill. "Let me out," she shrieked. "Pull over now." The response was clipped, absolute. "No." The pursuit dragged on, skidding turns through the blinding snow, bullets ricocheting off armored panels. When it finally ended, she remained huddled, shaking. "Get up." A grip on her arm hauled her upright. Through the fractured glass, A secluded estate loomed amid the firs, lights flickering like distant stars against the storm. He was already out, circling to her door. When he wrenched it open, his face was unyielding. Lainey shrank against the seat, her voice trembling. "I'm not going in there with you." His fingers clamped around her wrist, ironclad, and he tugged her into the gale, steering her toward the heavy doors. "Let go!" She wrenched against him. "I said, let me go." His tone was gravel, eyes scanning the tree line as he marched. "Wrong car. Those rivals saw you with me. Now you're staying. I'm not." She dug her heels into the snow. "Tell them it was a mistake. Won't change a thing." Still advancing. "They assume you're involved. They'll hunt you down or worse." Her pulse iced over, but she kept resisting. "You can't just—" "Quiet." The order snapped like a branch in the wind. "I've got a mess to clean up." The estate's door swung wide. A weathered foreman type burst out, rifle slung over his shoulder, grizzled beard flecked with snow. "Boss, what the hell?" The man spotted Lainey and halted, suspicion melting into a rough grin. "Well, damn. You finally brought someone home for the holiday." His eyes crinkled, appraising her. "She's got that bookish look, fits right in with your secrets, Wyatt." "No, I'm not." Lainey tried to pull free, words lost in the man's hearty slap on Wyatt's back. The foreman chuckled, ignoring her protest. "Look at her, all wide-eyed. Where'd you find this one, boss? Been keeping her tucked away like one of your ledgers?" Desperation cracked Lainey's voice. "I'm not with him." Lainey Prescott yanked open the heavy door of the black SUV, her breath coming in ragged white plumes. The leather interior smelled of expensive tobacco and cedarwood, a stark contrast to the scent of stale grease and pine-scented floor cleaner lingering on her coat from the diner. She didn't look at the driver. She didn't check the dash. Her fingers were so numb they felt like wooden pegs as she fumbled with her seatbelt, her dead phone sliding into the crevice of the seat. "Thank God you're here," she breathed, leaning her head back against the headrest. "The heater, please. I think my toes are actually frozen solid." "It's just to the old library house on Miller Street." Silence met her. Not the bored, professional silence of a hired driver, but a heavy, pressurized stillness that made the hair on her arms stand up. Lainey's eyes snapped open. She looked toward the front, expecting to see a local face, perhaps one of the boys she'd grown up with in this dying timber town. Instead, she saw a wall of a man. Wyatt Jennings sat behind the wheel, his large hands gripped at 10 and 2, knuckles white. In the dim glow of the dashboard, his profile looked like it had been hacked out of the very granite that made up the Cascades, sharp, unyielding, and terrifyingly cold. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the side mirror, his eyes like polished obsidian. "I didn't call for a librarian," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate in Lainey's chest. Lainey's heart gave a violent thud. You're not my driver." She reached for the door handle, her instinct to flee overriding the cold. "I'm so sorry, I thought." She yanked the handle. It didn't budge. She pulled again, harder, panic rising in her throat like bile. "The door is stuck. Unlock it, please." Wyatt's hand moved with a speed that defied his size. He didn't reach for the lock. He reached for the center console, pinning the electronic child locks. The heavy thunk of the deadbolts echoing through the cabin sounded like a gavel. "I said unlock the door." Lainey's voice cracked, her hand slamming against the reinforced glass. "Stay down," Wyatt commanded. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even an explanation. "What? No, let me out of this." The world outside erupted. A sudden, sharp crack, crack, crack splintered the midnight air. Lainey saw the neon sign of the diner behind them shatter, the open light dying in a spray of sparks. For a split second, her brain refused to process the sound. Then, a bullet hissed through the air, punching a clean, spiderwebbed hole through the rear passenger window just inches from her head. Down, Wyatt roared. He didn't wait for her to comply. He reached back, his massive palm catching her shoulder and shoving her onto the floorboards. At the same moment, he slammed his foot onto the accelerator. The SUV didn't just move. It launched. Lainey's head cracked against the back of the front seat as the vehicle roared to life, the tires screaming as they fought for purchase on the icy asphalt. Lainey lay huddled in the footwell, her face pressed against the high-end floor mats, smelling that cedar and steel scent of him. Above her, more bullets pinged off the SUV's armored skin like lethal hailstones. She heard Wyatt swearing in a low, rhythmic cadence, his movements fluid and calm despite the chaos. He yanked the steering wheel hard to the left, sending the vehicle into a controlled slide that threw Lainey against the door. "Who is shooting?" she screamed, the sound muffled by the roar of the engine. "Why are they shooting at us?" "They aren't shooting at us, little bird," Wyatt said, his voice terrifyingly steady as he navigated a blind turn onto a logging road, the tires kicking up a spray of slush and gravel. "They're shooting at me. You just happened to pick the worst possible place to sit." The SUV lurched as they hit the uneven terrain of the forest road, the shadows of the towering fir trees swallowing them whole. The diner, the New Year's countdown, and the quiet life Lainey had cultivated in the archives were gone, stripped away in a 3-minute hail of lead. She tried to push herself up, to see if the other car was following, but Wyatt's hand remained firm on her shoulder, pinning her to the floor. Through the gap in the seats, she could see the speedometer climbing 60, 70, 80, on a road meant for 30. "Please," she sobbed, the reality of her captivity finally sinking in. "Just let me out. I won't say anything. I'll tell the police I didn't see a thing." Wyatt glanced down at her then, his eyes catching the light of the high beams reflecting off the snow. There was no pity in them, only a grim, possessive resolve. "The police are 10 miles away and 20 minutes too late," he said, his jaw tightening as he glanced at the rearview mirror. "And those men? They saw you get in. In their world, that makes you mine. If I let you out now, you're a corpse before the ball drops." He turned the wheel sharply, plunging them deeper into the darkness of the mountains where the law didn't reach. "You're not leaving, Lainey. Not tonight. Maybe not ever." The black SUV climbed higher into the Cascades, the engine a low, predatory growl that drowned out the whistling wind. Lainey remained on the floorboards, her cheek pressed against the cold leather, watching the shadows of ancient fir trees strobe across the interior. The violence of the diner parking lot felt like a fever dream, but the stinging cold from the shattered rear window was a harsh, physical reality. Every time she tried to shift, Wyatt's heavy silence acted like a physical weight, keeping her pinned. He drove with a terrifying, rhythmic precision, navigating hairpin turns that should have been impossible in a blizzard. Eventually, the rough vibrations of the logging road smoothed out into heated pavement. Massive wrought iron gates, topped with jagged decorative pikes, groaned open as they approached, then hissed shut with a finality that made Lainey's stomach drop. They moved up a winding driveway lined with towering evergreens that stood like sentinels in the dark. When the vehicle finally hummed to a stop, the silence that followed was deafening. "Get up," Wyatt said. It wasn't a request. He was already out of the car, his boots crunching in the fresh powder. Before Lainey could even reach for the handle, the door was yanked open. The mountain air hit her like a sheet of ice, stealing the breath from her lungs. Wyatt didn't wait for her to find her footing. He reached in, his hand closing around her upper arm with the strength of a vice, and hauled her out. She stumbled, her thin boots sliding on the ice, but he held her upright, dragging her toward a sprawling structure of dark timber and river stone. It wasn't a house so much as a fortress, a masterpiece of rugged architecture that seemed to grow directly out of the mountainside. Warm light spilled from floor-to-ceiling windows, but it offered no comfort to Lainey. She looked back at the gates, now invisible in the swirling white, and realized the scale of her isolation. "You can't do this," she stammered, her teeth chattering so hard it hurt. "I have a job. People will notice I'm gone." Wyatt stopped at the massive oak front door, turning to look at her for the first time since the shooting. In the glow of the porch light, he looked even more formidable, a man who lived by his own laws in a place where the world's rules didn't apply. "You're a librarian, Lainey. You spend your life among the dead and the forgotten. Who is going to come looking for you on New Year's Day? Your landlord? The overdue book files?" The truth of his words stung worse than the cold. He pushed the door open and let her inside. The foyer was vaulted, smelling of wood smoke and beeswax, but he didn't stop to let her take it in. He marched her down a long corridor, past darkened rooms and flickering fireplaces, until they reached a heavy door at the end of the north wing. He pushed her inside and stepped back, his presence filling the doorway. "This is where you stay," he told her. "The windows are reinforced. The door stays locked from the outside. There's food in the pantry, and a fire in the grate. Don't try the vents. Wyatt, please." The door clicked shut, the heavy thud of a deadbolt sealing her in. Lainey rushed to the wood, pounding her fists against it until her knuckles bled. But there was no response, only the fading sound of his footsteps on the hardwood. Exhausted and trembling, she finally turned around to survey her cage, and her breath caught. She wasn't in a bedroom. She was in a vast, private library, but not like the one she worked in. The walls were lined with thousands of leather-bound volumes, but it was the tables in the center of the room that drew her forward. Spread out across the mahogany surfaces were meticulously organized stacks of documents, old maps of the county, and boxes of microfiche. As she moved closer, her heart began to race. These weren't just random papers. They were the very archives she had been obsessed with, the missing persons reports from the 1,980 seconds, the original land deeds for the lumber mill, and photographs of the town's founding families that had never been made public. She picked up a faded Polaroid from a stack. It showed a group of men standing in front of the mill 30 years ago, and in the center stood a younger version of the man she had seen in the diner, the man Wyatt had just fled from. This room wasn't just a library, it was a map of the town's sins. She was trapped in a fortress in the firs, surrounded by the very secrets she had spent her life trying to uncover, held captive by the man who sat at the center of them all. For the first time, Lainey realized that Wyatt Jennings hadn't just taken her to save her life. He had taken her because she knew how to read the maps he wanted hidden. The silence of the archive room was thick, heavy with the weight of decades-old secrets. But as Lainey moved deeper into the shadows near the far bookshelves, she realized she wasn't alone. A soft, rhythmic scratching sound like a mouse behind a baseboard drew her toward a heavy velvet curtain that masked a small alcove. She pulled it back, her heart hammering against her ribs, and found herself staring into a pair of wide, terrified eyes. A girl, no older than 15, was curled into a tight ball on the floor. She wore an oversized flannel shirt stained with grease and dirt, and her face was smudged with wood ash. This was Bertie Finch, the runaway whose face had been plastered on a few missing posters in town before they were mysteriously torn down. She clutched a tattered notebook to her chest as if it were a shield. "I'm not supposed to be here," the girl whispered, her voice trembling so violently it was barely audible. "He'll kill us both if he knows I talked." Lainey knelt, keeping her distance to avoid spooking the girl further. "Wyatt? He's the one who locked me in here. I'm Lainey. I work at the library." Bertie let out a jagged, bitter laugh that sounded too old for her face. "Not Wyatt. He's the one keeping the monsters out. It's the men at the mill, the ones who think he doesn't know what they're doing when the sun goes down." Lainey glanced back at the documents on the table, the land deeds, and the maps of the lumber yard. "What did you see, Bertie? Everyone says you just ran away." "I saw the impossible," Bertie said, her eyes darting toward the locked door. She crawled closer to Lainey, the smell of damp earth and fear clinging to her. "The mill isn't just cutting timber, Lainey. I followed my brother there one night because he wasn't coming home. I thought he was just working late shifts. But the saws, they weren't running. They were moving the floor. Lainey felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Moving the floor? There's a massive concrete vault under the main blade, Birdie whispered, her words coming faster now, desperate to be shared. They don't bring trees in at midnight. They bring crates from the coast. I saw them opening one. It wasn't drugs or money. It was people. People who looked like they'd been scrubbed out of existence. My brother. He was helping them. And then I saw Wyatt's second in command, that man with the scar on his hand, shaking hands with someone who shouldn't have been there. A Valente. Lainey's breath hitched. The Valentes were a name whispered in the dark corners of the Pacific Northwest. A syndicate that made Wyatt's mountain crew look like amateurs. If Wyatt owns the mill, he must know. He doesn't, Birdie insisted, clutching Lainey's arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. That's the impossible part. Wyatt thinks he's running a clean operation to protect this town's economy. His own men are using his name and his trucks to move human cargo right under his nose. I saw Wyatt walk through the mill 10 minutes after a shipment arrived, and they had it all hidden. They're playing him. And if he finds out, they'll kill him too. Lainey looked at the Polaroids on the table, specifically at a photo of Wyatt's father standing in front of that same mill. The town's history wasn't just a record of the past. It was a blueprint for a betrayal happening in real time. She realized then that Wyatt Jennings wasn't just her captor. He was a man standing on a crumbling pedestal, surrounded by vipers he called brothers. He needs to know, Lainey said, looking at the heavy oak door. No, Birdie whimpered, pulling back into the shadows. If you tell him, they'll know I'm the one who saw. They've been hunting me for 3 weeks. Why do you think Wyatt has this house locked down like a tomb? He found me in the woods and brought me here because he knows someone is hunting witnesses. But he doesn't know the killers are the men he drinks with every Friday night. Lainey looked at the girl, then back at the door. The archives had taught her that the truth usually came too late to save anyone. As the wind howled outside, shaking the heavy timber frames of the mansion, she realized the wrong car hadn't just put her in the path of a mafia boss. It had dropped her into the center of a ghost story that was about to turn into a massacre. She wasn't just a librarian anymore. She was the only one who could see the rot in the wood before the whole house came down. The roar of a diesel engine cutting through the mountain silence pulled Lainey away from the shadows of the alcove. She scrambled to the heavy, narrow window that looked out over the front courtyard, her breath fogging the glass as she wiped a desperate circle into the frost. Below, the sprawling driveway was illuminated by the flashing amber lights of a county vehicle. It wasn't the cavalry she had hoped for. It was a lone, battered patrol truck with the crest of the local sheriff's department on the door. Deputy Colton Brooks stepped out of the vehicle, his silhouette lean and weary against the blinding white of the blizzard. He looked exactly as he had in the town's old newspaper clippings, a man burdened by the weight of a badge in a town that didn't want to be policed. He adjusted his hat against the wind, his gaze sweeping over the stone facade of the mansion with practiced suspicion. From the hallway, Lainey heard the heavy, rhythmic stride of Wyatt Jennings. She threw herself against the oak door, her fingers clawing at the wood. "Colton!" She tried to scream, but her voice was a dry rasp, the terror of the last few hours stripping the strength from her lungs. She hammered her fist against the paneling, but the wood was too thick, the construction too solid. It swallowed her plea before it could reach the glass. Outside, Wyatt appeared on the porch, his massive frame dwarfing the deputy. He didn't have a coat on, standing in his black button-down shirt as if the sub-zero temperatures couldn't touch him. Even from the second floor, Lainey could feel the radiation of his authority. The two men stood in a tense standoff, the snowfall swirling between them like a shroud. "Late for a social call, Brooks." Wyatt's voice carried upward, muffled but distinct. "Wasn't looking for a drink, Jennings," Colton replied, his hand resting habitually near his belt. "We found a mess down at the diner. Shell casings from a submachine gun and a shattered window. People say a black SUV matching yours was seen flying toward the logging roads. And a girl is missing. Lainey Prescott, the librarian. Lainey pressed her face against the window, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. Look up, she pleaded silently. Just look at the window. She grabbed a heavy brass bookend from a nearby shelf and prepared to shatter the glass. But a sudden movement in the courtyard stopped her cold. Two of Wyatt's men with the same cold, predatory eyes she had seen in the diner parking lot, stepped out from the shadows of the garage. They didn't speak. They simply stood there, hands tucked into heavy tactical jackets, flanking the deputy in a silent, lethal semicircle. Colton Brooks felt the shift in the air. His shoulders tensed, his head turning slightly to acknowledge the threat. Wyatt stepped closer to the deputy, leaning into his personal space with a chilling calm. Lainey Prescott isn't here, Colton. And if I were you, I'd be more worried about the roads. This storm is going to turn the pass into a graveyard by morning. You should get back to town while you still have a trail to follow. I'm not leaving until I see the guest logs for this property, Wyatt. I know you're hiding something. I can smell the cordite on you from here. Wyatt's jaw tightened. You're on private land, deputy. Without a warrant, you're just a man out for a drive who lost his way. Don't let the snow bury you. Lainey raised the brass bookend, her arm trembling. She was seconds away from swinging when she felt a small, cold hand catch her wrist. She turned to find Bertie Finch standing behind her, her face pale with dread. Don't, the girl whispered. If you break that glass, they won't just kill the deputy. They'll kill us before he even makes it to the door. Wyatt isn't the one you have to worry about right now. Look at the man behind the deputy. Lainey looked back down. Standing near the patrol truck was the man Bertie had described, the one with the scar on his hand. He was holding a suppressed pistol behind his leg, his eyes fixed on the back of Colton's head, waiting for a single signal from Wyatt. But Wyatt didn't give it. Instead, Wyatt stepped back and pointed toward the gate. Colton Brooks lingered, his eyes searching the dark windows of the upper floor for one more agonizing second. Lainey froze, her hand still raised with the heavy brass weight, her eyes locked onto his. For a heartbeat, she thought he saw the shimmer of her reflection. But then, he turned, climbed back into his truck, and began the slow, sliding retreat down the mountain. Lainey dropped the bookend, the heavy metal thudding into the carpet as the amber lights vanished into the white. She was alone again, trapped in a house of secrets, watched by a man who was both her protector and her captor, while the only man who could save her drove away into the night. The heavy thud of the deadbolt retreating was the only warning Lainey had before Wyatt Jennings re-entered the room. The cold from the porch still clung to him, a sharp, metallic scent that cut through the dust of the archives. He didn't look like a man who had just stared down a deputy. He looked like a man who had just finished a day's work at the mill, weary but dangerously alert. He carried a silver basin of steaming water and a roll of clean linen. Sit, he commanded, gesturing toward a velvet armchair near the dying fire. Lainey didn't move. She remained by the window, her hands still trembling from the sight of Colton's retreating taillights. He knows I'm missing, Wyatt. You heard him. He's going to come back with a warrant and half the state patrol. Wyatt set the basin down on a low table and finally turned his full attention to her. The firelight played across the harsh angles of his face, softening nothing. Brooks is a good man, but he's a man who follows a map that doesn't exist anymore. By morning, the only road into this valley will be buried under 4 feet of fresh powder. No one is coming, Lainey. Not for a long time. He moved toward her, his size closing the distance in 2 strides. He didn't wait for her consent. He simply reached down and scooped her up, carrying her to the chair as if she weighed no more than the old ledgers on the shelves. He knelt at her feet, a position of supplication that felt entirely wrong for a man of his stature. He began to unlace her boots, his large fingers working with a gentleness that made her throat tighten. When he pulled the damp, thin socks away, her toes were a ghostly, waxy white. "You're a fool," he muttered, though there was no heat in the insult. He dipped a cloth into the warm water and began to press it against her skin. You ran out into a Cascades blizzard in city boots. You're lucky the skin isn't turning black. The heat hit her frozen nerves, and Lainey gasped, her hands gripping the arms of the chair. The pain was sharp and stinging, like 1,000 needles pricking her skin at once. Why are you doing this? She whispered, looking down at the dark crown of his head. You could have just let me out at the diner. You could have let the deputy take me. Wyatt stopped his movements, his hands still cupping her feet to share his warmth. He didn't look up. If you had stepped out of that car, my second in command would have put a bullet in your head before your feet touched the slush. My own men, Lainey, the men I pay, the men I grew up with, they're looking for a reason to tear me down. Taking you made you a variable. Leaving you would have made you a casualty. He looked up then, and for the first time, the stone mask cracked. She saw the exhaustion in the creases around his eyes, the weight of a man who was realizing his empire was built on quicksand. This town thinks I'm the one who holds the leash. They think the Jennings name means I own every shadow in these woods. But the rot started long ago, and it's deeper than the mill. There are things moving through this valley that even I can't stop. Not without a war. Birdie told me. Lainey said, her voice small. About the mill. About what they're moving at night. Wyatt's grip tightened almost imperceptibly. He didn't ask how she knew. He seemed to accept that in this house, secrets were the only currency. Then you understand. You can't go back to that library, Lainey. You can't go back to your quiet life of filing away the past. You know the present now. And in this town, the present is a death sentence. He stood up, taking the basin, but paused at the door. The fire flared behind him, casting his shadow long across the floor, reaching toward the alcove where Birdie was hidden. I'm not keeping you here to be a villain, little bird. I'm keeping you here because as long as you're behind these walls, you're mine. And no one touches what belongs to me. Not the law, and certainly not the vipers I call my friends. He left without another word, the lock clicking back into place. Lainey looked down at her feet, now pink and warm, and felt a terrifying shift in her own heart. The wrong car had taken her to a fortress, but as she looked at the heavy door, she realized the most dangerous thing in the house wasn't the men with guns outside. It was the man who had just healed her, and the way she was starting to wish he would never open that door again. The opportunity arrived at 4 a.m, during the dead-eye hour when the night shift at the estate swapped with the dawn patrol. The snow had tapered off into a fine, crystalline dust, and the wind had died down to a rhythmic moan through the firs. Inside the library, the air was unnervingly still. Lainey checked the heavy oak door one last time. The lock remained engaged, but the service hatch in the pantry, a small, waist-high door used for wood deliveries, had been left unlatched after Wyatt's departure. It was a lapse in security, or perhaps a test. Lainey didn't care which. We have to go now, Lainey whispered, reaching into the alcove. Birdie emerged, her small face pale and pinched with a mixture of terror and sudden hope. She gripped her tattered notebook as if it were a compass. If we stay, we're just waiting for the vipers to bite. Wyatt can't watch every door forever. They moved through the darkened service corridor like shadows, their breath held tight in their chests. The wood delivery hatch opened with a reluctant groan of frozen hinges. Lainey went first, sliding out into the waist-deep powder, the cold instantly biting through her leggings. She reached back to help Birdie, and then they were running, or as close to running as the heavy drifts allowed, toward the black, jagged line of the forest. The mansion loomed behind them, a monolith of stone and secrets, its windows watching them like cold eyes. Once they hit the tree line, the world changed. The forest was a labyrinth of silver and shadow, the towering firs creating a canopy that blotted out the moon. Lainey led the way, her mind racing through the old topographical maps she had studied in the archives. She knew there was a creek 3 miles east that never fully froze. If they followed it, it would lead them toward the lower valley and the main highway. Wait, Birdie hissed. grabbing Laney's coat. They froze. At first, there was only the sound of their own frantic heartbeats. Then, a sharp, metallic clack echoed through the trees, the unmistakable sound of a bolt action being cycled. It wasn't coming from the house. It was ahead of them. "I told you, little bird," a voice called out, smooth and cold as a razor blade. "You can't hide in a forest I've been hunting in since I was 6. Silas, Wyatt's second in command, stepped out from behind a massive cedar. In the dim light, the jagged scar across his hand looked like a brand. He wasn't wearing a tactical vest or the formal attire of Wyatt's inner circle. He was dressed in hunting whites, blending almost perfectly into the snow. He held a long-range rifle with a casual, terrifying familiarity. "Silas!" Laney gasped, stepping in front of Birdie. "Wyatt told us to stay in the house. If you hurt us, he'll—" "Wyatt is a sentimental fool who thinks he's still running a family business," Silas interrupted, taking a slow step forward. The snow didn't even crunch under his boots. "He thinks he's protecting the town. But the Valentes offer something Wyatt never could. Expansion. Profit. A way out of this dying timber hole. And you two? You're the only loose threads left in a very expensive tapestry." He raised the rifle, the barrel leveling toward Laney's chest. "Wyatt wanted to keep you as a pet, Laney. He saw something in you, some ghost of the girl he lost years ago, maybe. But I just see a librarian who knows too much about my shipping manifests." "Run," Laney whispered to Birdie, her hand finding a heavy, jagged branch buried in the snow. "Don't bother," Silas sneered. "The hounds are already out. You think Wyatt is the only one who knows these woods? I've had men stationed at the creek since midnight. There is no away for you." Just as Silas tightened his finger on the trigger, a low, guttural snarl vibrated through the air. It wasn't human, and it didn't sound like a dog. A massive shape erupted from the darkness to their left, a blur of black and gray that slammed into Silas with the force of a falling tree. The rifle discharged, the bullet splintering a branch inches above Laney's head. Silas screamed as he was driven into the snow. Through the chaos of flying powder and thrashing limbs, Laney saw Wyatt Jennings. He wasn't the man who had gently bathed her feet an hour ago. He was a force of nature, his hands wrapped around Silas's throat, his face a mask of primal fury. "I told you," Wyatt roared, his voice echoing off the mountainside like thunder, "that she belongs to me." The woods erupted in motion as Wyatt's loyalists closed in from the shadows, surrounding the area. Silas was pinned, his face turning a sickly purple as Wyatt's grip tightened. Laney stood paralyzed, the branch still clutched in her hand, realizing that the escape she had planned was a delusion. There was no leaving the mountain. The war Birdie had predicted hadn't started at the mill. It had started right here, in the blood-stained snow of the new year. The crunch of snow beneath Silas's thrashing body was the only sound in the frozen glade until the wet, sickening crack of a jaw echoed through the trees. Wyatt didn't use a weapon. He didn't need one. He used the sheer, terrifying momentum of a man who had been pushed past the brink of civility. He drove his knee into Silas's ribs, a sound like dry kindling snapping, and pinned the traitor to the earth with a single, massive hand around his throat. Laney pulled Birdie back, shielding the girl's eyes, but she couldn't look away herself.